Okay, welcome everyone to our monthly immigration series. This is our first of what will be a monthly first Tuesday of the month series to update you on what's going on with immigration on the state, local, and federal level. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Ashley Morris. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the organizing director here at the ACLU of Northern California. I'm based in our San Francisco office, and I will hand it over to my colleagues to introduce themselves as well.
Hey everyone, my name is Luis Ojeda, pronouns are he, him, and I'm an organizing manager and I'm based in Fresno.
Hello, everyone. My name is Carlos Montes, pronouns he, him. I'm a senior organizer based out of the Sacramento region.
We invite you all to introduce yourselves in the chat. Let us know where you're from, why you're here tonight, what you're hoping to learn about. One other note is that Zoom meetings now have the Q&A feature that used to be limited to just Zoom webinars. So that's a much easier way for us to track the questions that you all have over the course of this. So if you have a question, please type it in the Q&A box. You can click on the little Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Type your questions there. That'll make it easier for us as staff to track the questions. And then, of course, you're welcome to also continue to chat with people and share your thoughts in the chat window. So what we are going to do this evening is start with some updates on executive orders and some of the things that are happening on the federal front. Then we will talk a little bit about a couple of lawsuits recently filed here in California. And then Luis will give a brief Know Your Rights training. And then the idea is that every month we will update you on some different issues that are coming to the fore related to immigration. So we will start with the national updates. Since Donald Trump took office in January, he's already issued 119, I think as of today, executive actions. So we're going to start by reviewing and providing some updates on the ones that are related to immigration. So first off, this is one that you've probably heard quite a bit about. This is the executive order that seeks to strip certain babies who are born in the United States of their U.S. citizenship. This order violates the 14th Amendment. It denies a core American value, and it would make us a country that deports children who were born here to countries that they've literally never seen. It's cruel, it's racist, it's unconstitutional, and it would completely wreak havoc on our communities. We knew this one was coming. Trump has talked a lot about birthright citizenship and his issues with it. So the National ACLU, along with the ACLUs of New Hampshire and Massachusetts, and several other partner organizations filed a lawsuit immediately challenging this order. And on February 10th, a federal judge in New Hampshire issued a preliminary injunction blocking the order from taking effect. I think it was supposed to take effect a month after it was issued. So it would have taken effect on February 20th. We do have a petition running to Congress to urge them to take action to protect birthright citizenship in the 14th Amendment, and we will place that link in the chat.
Thank you. Another order that was issued on the same day, as folks I'm sure remember, on January 20th, there was a flurry of executive orders that were taken. One is around expedited removal. So this essentially directs DHS to expand expedited removal to people who have been in the country for less than 2 years. And there's another way that he is seeking to expand the use of detention. So expedited removal essentially means that folks would have less access to a judge and a hearing and sort of those different processes that sort of slow down the deportation process, and end up with having folks being deported more quickly. And again, this is for mostly will apply, or it does apply for folks who are here for less than 2 years. But obviously, that's still a large number of people. We know that Donald Trump ran on a campaign of mass deportations, and so he's obviously wasted no time trying to put his xenophobia into action. Another component of this executive order is that it requires non-citizens to register and face criminal penalties for non-compliance. So there was some more information that was released more recently on this as well. and it's sort of unclear how it's going to work still. But obviously, it's causing a lot of confusion and fear amongst the undocumented community. And so we'll see sort of how this pans out. But obviously, this is very troubling and very concerning, to say the least. Additionally, as with a lot of other components of this executive order, it also threatens cutting of federal funding for sanctuary jurisdictions. So we'll say a little bit more on other ways that they're trying to go about doing this, but in this sense, it's really trying to get a sense of how federal funding is being used by certain sanctuary quote unquote jurisdictions, and trying to figure out ways to cut that funding. So that has been a tactic that the administration has been using since they took office, trying to cut lots of funding from the federal government. Additionally, it also limits parole, TPS, and other protections, which is really a concern, obviously. And I think it's something that that folks are monitoring. And there's also a case that we'll speak to on this later. But again, lots of different components of this executive order, and some that I'm not covering. But to say the least, most of it is all anti-immigrant and trying to make the lives of immigrants more difficult, and trying to eliminate access to relief. So really concerning stuff here.
Yeah, we're not covering every detail of all of these because it's a lot, but you can go right to the Trump's administration's website and read them all for yourself. I did a lot of reading of these today and it was unpleasant. So I don't necessarily encourage that. The next one that I want to talk about is also from day one. It does several things. It's called Securing Our Borders, but some key components of it include eliminating the CBP One app, the Customs and Border Protection app that initially was created to expedite, I think, truck crossings across the border, but later was updated to allow people to use it to make appointments to seek asylum at the US-Mexico border. So it does away with that app entirely. It also requires asylum seekers to be detained while they await a decision on their claims, asylum claims, rather than allowing them to remain in the US while they await their hearings. It reinstates the Remain in Mexico program, which requires asylum seekers arriving at the border via Mexico to remain in Mexico while they await their asylum hearing or decision, which can take some time, especially now. ACLU and our partners sued the Biden administration last year after it announced a rule that barred access to asylum until the number of daily encounters at the US-Mexico border fell below a certain threshold of people over a certain period of time. They then extended that period of time, really significantly restricting access to asylum already. And that problem will be further exacerbated by this order. So that litigation is ongoing.
Thank you. The next executive order that we'll be discussing, again, was also issued on January 20th, called Guaranteeing the State's Protection Against Invasion. Do want to highlight this use of the term invasion that obviously the Trump administration used many times during the campaign, and is really an awful framing that doesn't accurately reflect the reality. But obviously there's been a lot of hyperbolic comments and statements that the administration has been making to really try to defend these actions by trying to call folks who are seeking asylum and refugee status and other forms of immigration relief, referring to all that as an invasion. And so again, this invokes invasion at the southern border to suspend entry and bar people arriving at the border from applying for asylum or any other protection, which is really unprecedented. Obviously, this is super concerning in the sense because obviously it means that folks don't have access to that those forms of immigration relief that they had in the past. This is also a pending lawsuit that was filed on February 3rd by the ACLU, and so again, there's lots of efforts that we are trying to make to try and put a stop to this. This action does ignore protections that were put in place by Congress and backed by the courts for generations that ensure people have a chance to have their asylum claims heard. And so again, we believe that this is an attempt to overstep his authority and try to overstep Congress's actions that were put into place in the past. But again, super concerning in terms of limiting access to asylum. And obviously people are very much being impacted by this as we speak.
The next two are related to the military at the US-Mexico border. One of them calls on the Defense Secretary to deliver a plan to seal the border and, quote, repel forms of invasion, including mass migration. And there's a lot of talk in multiple of these executive orders about invasion in the form of mass migration. So I think that's just like an important thing to keep in mind about how immigration is being characterized generally and how that relates to several of these executive orders. The other one claims that America's sovereignty is under attack and calls on the armed forces to assist the Department of Homeland Security to take, quote, full control of the border. So these ones are pretty scary.
Another executive order that was issued on January 20th dealt with our refugee program. This essentially suspended refugee resettlement in the US, and it directs the Homeland Security Secretary and the Secretary of State to submit a report to the Trump administration within 90 days, detailing whether the refugee resettlement program would resume, as well as to submit additional reports every 3 months until Trump decides to no longer suspend refugee resettlement. And so this really could lead to a long-term elimination of the resettlement of folks who are seeking refuge to this country. And so again, just another attempt at limiting immigration to this country, and super concerning because obviously folks who are seeking to come to the US under the refugee admissions program are some of the folks who are going through war in their home countries or other major issues that are forcing them to resettle. And so again, this is really, really concerning.
Next up, we have one related to cartel designation as terrorist organizations that was also issued on day one. This one asks various cabinet secretaries to come up with a list of cartels and similar groups to be considered for designation as foreign terrorist organizations and specially designated global terrorists. It does exactly what Trump promised he would do on the campaign trail. It orders preparations for possible invocation of the Alien Enemies Act, which is designed to be invoked only if the US is at war or being invaded or threatened with invasion, and has not been used since World War II. And I believe this is another one that uses a lot of that invasion at the border language that is becoming very ubiquitous from the Trump administration.
And one more thing to note about this one is that we know that oftentimes law enforcement uses gang affiliation or some connection to gangs as a reason to then lock people up or target folks. And so just want to note that if more cartels or gangs are being designated as terrorist organizations, that could then lead to additional folks sort of being considered ineligible or being targeted. And so again, while a lot of this may seem not harmless or not as harmful as it could be, the implications or the ramifications of it could be much larger than what we know at the moment. Another one, which is a sort of a Muslim ban, travel ban 2.0 type of thing, 3.0 at this point. I'm not sure what 0.0 we're at, but this was also issued on January 20th, and this orders a report within 60 days of that January 20th date that would outline countries throughout the world for which vetting and screening information is so deficient as to warrant a partial or full suspension on the admission of nationals from those countries. And so, again, folks in the administration, folks who are putting these reports together, these are folks who are xenophobic, who are anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim. And so we know that the kinds of recommendations that they would put together are going to end up harming our communities. And we know that this has a potential to turn into another travel ban, like those that we saw during the first Trump administration. And then additionally, it seeks to screen and vet immigrants more closely based on ideology, which again could lead to targeting of folks from different Muslim countries, Muslim majority countries, or based on any other ideology that the US sees as quote unquote anti-American. So that is another one that we are taking a close look at. And again, this report isn't going to come out until 60 days. And so the impact of that will not be felt for another couple weeks now at this point, based on the timeline.
Next up, we have expanding Migrant Operations Center at Naval Station Guantanamo Bay to full capacity. ACLU and our partners have filed a lawsuit to challenge this January 29 order to expand the Migrant Operations Center at Guantanamo Bay. The lawsuit seeks to grant access for the plaintiffs, which are legal services organizations, to those individuals who are being transferred from the US to detention at Guantanamo Bay and currently do not have access to legal services. There's very little information about how long people will be held there, under what legal processes they will be held. And this further clarifies and indicates the Trump administration's utter disregard for the rule of law and the way our justice system is supposed to function. Guantanamo Bay is known as one of the world's most notorious prisons. It's historically operated under secrecy and with limited access to representation. And there's no telling what sorts of abuses could occur under the cover of the darkness at Guantanamo Bay. So this one is really disturbing, and hopefully the plaintiffs in this litigation will be able to gain access to their clients soon.
Another executive order that was more recent on the 20th of last month, now that it's March, called the Ending Taxpayer Subsidization of Open Borders. This seeks to identify federally funded programs that allow undocumented immigrants to access cash or non-cash benefits, calls for enhanced eligibility verification systems, and recommends eliminating access. And it also, again, directs OMB to gather info within 30 days. In general, we know that undocumented immigrants are already not eligible for federal programs. And so, again, this is a little bit redundant and sort of not necessary. But what this is going to lead to is going to be more obstacles for people who are lawfully eligible for programs, being able to gain access to those programs. And so, more paperwork or more loophole or obstacles or obstacles that folks have to overcome in order to be able to access those programs. And so, trying to do this under the guise of trying to limit funding for undocumented folks when they already don't have access to these types of programs. So again, another attack on the immigrant community.
Luis will talk about one more, but the last one that I'm going to talk about is the rescission of the sensitive locations guidance that was initially issued in 2011 and was later expanded by the Biden administration in 2021. The sensitive locations guidance is something that you've probably heard about, even if you haven't heard about it with that terminology, and it protects certain places, sensitive places like schools, hospitals, and churches from immigration enforcement. This is really critical to ensure that people can gather and can access basic services like healthcare and education. So Trump has rescinded that guidance that previously said that those sensitive locations were not places where immigration enforcement could occur. And he's done this as a way that is intended to really incite fear and have a chilling effect on the ability to gather and seek important services that are important to any community, including immigrant communities, to be able to thrive. It's important to note that immigration officers will still need a warrant or consent to enter private spaces, though they will be able to enter and engage in enforcement activity in public spaces freely now that this guidance has been rescinded.
You actually, and then one more thing I'll note on this is that this has obviously caused a lot of fear and panic amongst the immigrant community. A lot of folks are afraid to send their kids to school or to go to church or to go to the doctor or things like that, for fear of ICE being present. And so, you know, we do want to just uplift that real fear that folks are experiencing. But again, these policies being rescinded doesn't necessarily mean that they're only going to target, or that there's sort of this large effort currently underway to target these locations. But obviously, folks do need to be aware that protections that were previously in place may no longer be. Another thing that I will talk about in terms of an immigration update that happened, not because of the Trump administration, but because of the various court cases that the DACA program has undergone since its program started in 2012. It's continued to face lots of legal challenges, and there was a recent decision on January 17th, just before the administration went into office, by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, and they issued a decision finding that major parts of the Biden administration's DACA rule was unlawful. This does not mean that the program was terminated. It was essentially sort of sent back to another court to make a decision. And so the program continues. And so folks who have DACA are encouraged to continue renewing. I think the general recommendation is if it expires within 6 months to a year, you should consider reapplying. The case remains that no new applications are being processed. So if you didn't have DACA before this year or ever, they still are not accepting new applications. So that's important to note. Essentially, not much has changed in terms of who's eligible right now. And then another thing to know is that advanced parole is still available. But like legal consultation is recommended. So this is the ability for folks with DACA to leave the country under certain parameters, like if you have a sick family member or for work or school purposes. But obviously with changing administration, there's a lot of uncertainty, and at any moment something could change in terms of the program or DHS policies. And so that's why they recommend a legal consultation to just make sure that you are aware of the potential risks, because it is a bit risky in terms of leaving the country and potentially not being able to return if there are, again, changes in immigration policy or other things of that nature. But again, for now, the program continues, and so if anybody does have DACA, they should continue to renew it. Additionally, DACA does protect folks from deportation as well, and so obviously that's an important factor right now as folks are afraid of ICE raids and other activity happening in their communities.
I want to draw your attention to two cases that were filed in February by the ACLU of Northern California and others. First of all, ACLU NorCal, SoCal, and San Diego and Imperial counties, along with our law firm partner, Kecker Van Ness, have filed a lawsuit against the Department of Homeland Security, Customs and Border Protection, and the U.S. Border Patrol. This lawsuit was filed on behalf of the United Farm Workers and 5 Kern County residents, and it seeks to stop those federal entities that I just mentioned from stopping, arresting, and summarily expelling community members from the country using practices that violate the U.S. Constitution and federal law. In January, Border Patrol agents who were based at the border traveled to Bakersfield, which is like 300 miles, to launch Operation Return to Sender, which appears to have been designed to stop, detain, and arrest people of color who appeared to be farm workers or day laborers based on those law enforcement agents' assessment of what a farm worker or day laborer looks like, which is called racial profiling. Regardless of their immigration status, transport them to the El Centro Border Patrol Station, which is not close to Bakersfield, and then coerce them into voluntary departure, which can result in a years-long bar on re-entry to the United States. So that lawsuit was filed in February, and more to come on that. Secondly, I want to talk about a lawsuit that was brought on behalf of a group of Venezuelans with temporary protected status, or TPS, who sued the Trump administration over its unprecedented attempt to strip hundreds of thousands of people of lawful immigration status. The plaintiffs in the case are represented by ACLU NorCal and ACLU SoCal, as well as the National Day Labor Organizing Network, or NDLON, and the Center for Immigration Law and Policy at UCLA School of Law. The lawsuit accuses Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem of illegally revoking a 19-month extension of TPS for Venezuelans that the Biden administration granted back in January. And it means that 350,000 Venezuelans will lose their status on April 7th, and then another 250,000 will lose their status in September, rather than retaining protections through late 2026. That's 600,000 people. This illegal termination not only robs over 500,000 people of their legal status and their work permits, but it also could place them in very acute danger if they're forced to return to a country in the midst of an unprecedented economic and political crisis there in Venezuela. So the lawsuit argues that the Department of Homeland Security violated the Administrative Procedure Act and that the termination is motivated by racial animus in violation of the Fifth Amendment. Again, that was also very recently filed, just in late February. So more to come on that. And I want to give big accolades to our colleagues who have put so much work into gathering the information and working with the plaintiffs to get that case filed.
Thank you, Ashley. And as we mentioned earlier, obviously there's been a ton of other actions and announcements that the Trump administration has made over the past month and a half. And we wanted to just sort of acknowledge that we're not covering everything, but obviously it has been a lot. And also that that's intentional, right? That's the strategy that the administration is taking by essentially targeting everyone and everything in every which way they can, and hoping that some of it sticks. So just want to highlight a few things here. This headline about Trump saying that there's a 5 million gold card immigration visas and that they're going to sell like crazy. Another one related to the Trump administration preparing to restart immigrant family detention. We have seen news of DHS trying to seek and starting to make contracts with different prisons across the country. And in Dublin, as an example here in California, ICE is looking at that facility as a potential location for ICE detention. And so again, lots of concerning things happening. And then additionally, as I'm sure folks have heard, we are also now partnering with countries like Panama to deport folks. There are some countries that the U.S. does not have diplomatic relations, such as Iran and other countries. And so one of the strategies that the administration is using is essentially deporting immigrants from those countries to other countries, and then having those countries deal with the actual sending of folks back to their home country. And as Ashley mentioned, a lot of these folks are escaping for valid reasons, and they are afraid to return back to their countries, and they are not being they're not checking for those types of things, and so they're essentially just removing them without seeing if they qualify for any immigration relief. And so here's a picture of folks holding up a sign that says, "Please help us," in Panama, where folks were being held in a hotel and also in a Panamanian jungle in sort of a makeshift facility. And so yeah, a lot is happening, and we know that it can be really overwhelming. But again, hopefully this provided a little bit of an overview of all the different things that are happening, and how we and others are, trying to fight back and push back to ensure that a lot of the things that the Trump administration is trying to do is stopped. So we will leave it there. Again, encourage folks, if there's anything that maybe any headlines or any orders that we may have missed or you might have questions about, feel free to drop those into the Q&A, and we can discuss those a little bit shortly.
We take a couple of there's only a couple questions in there. You want to take those? I don't know the answer to this first one, but I'm going to ask it and see if Luis does. Is there currently any available mechanism by which a person seeking asylum can seek it and enter the US? And do you know?
I think the answer is no. There is no way. It seems like most of the asylum opportunities have essentially been eliminated. That could change, obviously. Again, a lot of these things were like, in 30 days, in 60 days, in 90 days, come back with an assessment or report. But again, they are claiming that this is an emergency, right? There's an invasion, and so everything's sort of on pause until Trump decides to unpause it.
Yeah, and you can apply for asylum if you're in the US, but then if your claim is denied, but then that's where like that catch and release thing comes in. And if your claim is denied, you could go into removal proceedings or will likely go into removal proceedings. So it all seems a bit tenuous at the moment. And we're not lawyers. This is not legal advice. The next one is about public schools. Public schools count as public spaces, correct?
Yes, they do.
We don't think so. First of all, next, and hopefully in our April webinar, we're going to cover schools and what you can be doing to advocate with your local school district to ensure that know your rights information is disseminated and that students are being protected in California schools, and there's some good guidance from the state attorney general, and we will likely have a model policy to share. So the April webinar, we will hopefully be able to cover that content. I think the general feeling is that it's not likely that a bunch of big immigration enforcement actions are going to happen at schools. That's not going to be prioritized. That's not to say that there's not a risk, but a lot of students and families are very, very afraid because of the rescission of the sensitive locations guidance, and it's very fair to be very afraid. And also it doesn't seem particularly likely that that will be the priority for targeting. So we don't want to create unnecessary fear. So just trying to kind of strike that balance. I'm going to take one more question, which is there any pending California legislation to offer some protection to our immigrant neighbors? Is the ACLU supporting any of those legislative efforts? We had also hoped that today we would be able to talk about state legislation. We are working on some potential legislative fixes to some of the remaining gaps in state law, but they're not super solidified yet. So hopefully by April 1st, well, they will have to be solid by April 1st because the bill language deadline is at the end of March. So by our April 1st webinar, we will have much more to tell you about both ACLU sponsored legislation and then anything else that's kind of happening on the legislative landscape related to immigration. So we'll move on now. We can take more questions at the end if we have time. So just quickly, before Luis dives into the Know Your Rights portion of this, I want to highlight a couple of important pieces of California legislation that provide protections. The first one is the California Values Act, which was passed after the first Trump election and is intended to minimize law enforcement collaboration with federal immigration enforcement and to minimize the number of people who are impacted by federal immigration enforcement after having some interaction with law enforcement in California. It does not cover CDCR, California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, which is the gap that we're hoping to fill with legislation this year. Local law enforcement like police and sheriffs can't ask people about their immigration status. They can't share your personal information with Immigration and Customs Enforcement unless your personal information is currently publicly available. If you're arrested, local police or county sheriffs cannot hold you in jail for extra time just for immigration enforcement agents to pick you up. They can't let immigration enforcement interview you without your consent, and you have the right to refuse the interview. And however, ICE and Border Patrol can be notified and people can be transferred if they have certain convictions, including state prison felony convictions and certain felony convictions and higher level misdemeanors. So California Values Act limits the ability for local law enforcement to provide information to and interact with federal law enforcement or federal immigration enforcement. And then there's a new law that just took effect on January 1st, which is a pretty big deal, which requires that law enforcement not ask people when they pull you over or interact with you at a traffic stop, why did I pull you over? Like in the past, you often would hear of stories where someone gets pulled over, law enforcement says, do you know why I pulled you over? And then they start maybe saying incriminating things or whatever. That's no longer allowed. And now law enforcement are required to state the reason for the traffic stop. So instead of saying, do you know why I pulled you over? They have to say, I pulled you over because I clocked you going 79 miles per hour. So important, and we'll be updating our Know Your Rights information with that new info. Handing it over to Luis.
And one thing to note about that, as far as I know, that does not apply to ICE. That is for California GHP, local law enforcement, California law enforcement. And so, but important to know nonetheless. All right, so I'm sure that some of you will have two screens going, listening to the address that the president is giving now and to us. Let us know how that's going, if there's anything we're missing. So a few things to note before we start. Immigration agents may violate your rights and lie to you. And I think that's an important thing to note, especially again, under this administration that has a lot of hate towards immigrants, has a lot of just negative feelings towards immigrants. I think there is likely to be an increase in the violation of folks' rights, as we've seen in Kern and in other places where they're using tactics that maybe weren't as common before or that appear just really awful. But it is important to remember to stay calm, not to run, argue, resist, or obstruct an officer, even if you believe your rights are being violated. And it's important to keep your hands where police can see them. Obviously, law enforcement still kills people on a regular basis, and so it is important for folks to just be aware of what they're up against. And in the moment, if your rights are being violated, it can be a really challenging thing to remain calm and to assert your rights. But again, it is still important for you to do so. Another thing that's important for immigrants in particular is to not lie about your status and not to provide any false documents. So we'll be saying this a lot, but that it's important to remain silent rather than say anything that you shouldn't say. And also for folks that maybe aren't from the US, that maybe have an ID from another country or anything like that, that can be obviously really harmful if you interact with ICE. And so it's important for folks maybe not to carry that around, and then additionally not to present any documents such as like a fake ID or fake, whatever documents if they are not valid. So just some things that sort of will apply regardless of sort of the different circumstances that we're going to go through and that folks should keep in mind. Additionally, there's this map here that our ACLU national colleagues have put together that is on our website that sort of outlines this sort of 100-mile border zone. So oftentimes people will think of the border as just being, down here between, around San Diego and then up there by Canada. But the coastal borders also sort of apply to that 100-mile radius where Border Patrol and other sort of immigration activity can happen. And so I think it's really important to know that even if you're not near a border, that doesn't mean that immigration or Customs and Border Protection won't be in your community. So again, just sort of speaking to the reality of the situation. Another thing that we wanted to sort of highlight is sort of trying to identify vehicles. This graphic that the Inland Coalition for Immigrant Justice put together on their Instagram that I've linked to here that folks can, again, get with the slides that we sent after the meeting. You can see here that these are two examples of immigration agent vehicles. And so oftentimes you'll see a green line for Border Patrol. And it could be an SUV, it could be a van, it could be a car, but oftentimes you'll see a green stripe on the vehicle. And then additionally, a blue stripe you'll often see for immigration as well. And again, the vehicle can be various types of vehicles. But you'll notice on the other side, these are sort of non-immigration enforcement vehicles. And so here's like the US Department of Agriculture, here's a Community Emergency Response Team, or California Highway Patrol, sort of standard cop cars. And then there's this Federal Protective Service vehicle, which is Homeland Security, that looks very similar to this blue car over here. But again, one will say Homeland Security, and then it'll say Federal Protective Service, while this one says US Customs and Border Protection. And so again, it can be a little bit confusing, but again, the blue and the green stripe can at least alert you to potential ICE activity or ICE vehicles. One more thing to note on this, though, is that sometimes ICE will be in unmarked vehicles. So that makes it really fun because obviously you can't tell, or it's much more difficult to tell whether they are ICE or what law enforcement agency they represent. And so obviously this isn't going to be entirely foolproof, but again, this is going to help in terms of identifying when you're in a situation where you're trying to figure out what vehicle is this. Another thing that's important for everyone to know is that the judicial warrant on the right is the valid warrant that in general you have to sort of acknowledge and respect and listen to. And this is generally, you'll see at the top, it says United States Court. It's signed by a judge at the bottom, and it has, it says right there, their name and all that. And then usually it'll have your name or the name of the person that the folks that whoever's presenting you with the warrant is looking for, and just more information essentially. Whereas the ICE administrative warrant on the left is the one that ICE will often utilize to pretend that this is a valid warrant to go after people. And again, this is not signed by a judge, and so at the top it says US Homeland Security, and it may also say ICE administrative warrant or something related to that. But again, this is a really important difference because again, oftentimes when people interact with law enforcement, they become very nervous and they're not sure what to do. But I think this is a good place to start in terms of like, do you have a warrant? And being able to identify and find those distinctions between when it's a valid judicial warrant, that again, generally speaking, you do have to sort of abide by, whereas an ICE administrative warrant is sort of like a made-up document that they're just sort of looking for somebody, and this is not the same. But again, some people are not familiar, and so oftentimes they'll sort of do the same regardless of which one is presented to them. So we'll walk through different scenarios when it comes to interacting with ICE, but again, knowing the difference and sort of what to look out for can be really helpful in a situation that can be very, very stressful for folks. Some other things to remember that I think are going to apply throughout and regardless of sort of where you are. One is preparing with your family and friends. If you yourself are an immigrant, or if you know someone who is an immigrant and who's sort of afraid of coming into contact with immigration, it's really important to prepare and think about what you would do in that scenario. have a plan and really discuss sort of what you would do in practice, so that when it does, or if it does happen, it doesn't come as a surprise. I think it's really important in this moment to really think about how to react and how to be most prepared. Additionally, it's important to assert your right to remain silent. Again, you do have that right regardless of your immigration status, and so it's really important for everyone to remember that. And oftentimes, that's really the best strategy, is to remain silent. I will say the general recommendation is that you vocally assert the right to remain silent and not just remain silent. And so you should say that I am asserting my right to remain silent, and I do not want to speak to you, and I will not answer questions, or any variation of that. But it's important that you're asserting your right. Additionally, you can also ask if you're free to leave. And so again, unless you're being arrested or are under arrest, you can ask if you are free to leave. And then if you are, obviously you're able to take yourself out of that situation. And then lastly, to remember to refuse to sign anything until you speak with a lawyer. Oftentimes, immigrants, again, because they're in a state of fear or panic, are asked to sign things, and they'll sign them without knowing what they're signing. And sometimes that can be a removal order that essentially makes the process of deporting them much faster. And so if folks want to fight their case and be able to slow down the process of deportation, not signing anything is always the best strategy in order to be able to get in touch with an attorney and help fight your case. So some things to remember. Okay, so I'm going to go through a few scenarios relatively quick, but again, I think you'll notice that there's a lot of sort of similarities in terms of how you interact with immigration when you come into contact with them in the different settings. And so it's really important for folks to sort of just remember some of these key points, and again, some of the things that I shared earlier that again are going to be very similar. So one is to not open the door in general. And so I think this is really important, again, a family conversation to have. For example, if you have children at home who often will run to the door to open the door, that's definitely not ideal, especially if, for example, ICE is at the door. So I think it's really important for folks to have that conversation about sort of how you answer the door and protocols around that, especially when you have children or other folks who maybe aren't sort of aware of the potential consequences that could have. But generally speaking, it's important not to open the door. If ICE is outside and they're knocking at your door, it's important to ask them to show you the warrant. And so again, going back to that judicial warrant, you want to confirm and make sure that they have an actual judicial warrant and not just that ICE administrative warrant, which again, if they have a judicial warrant, or if they don't have a judicial warrant and it's not valid, again, you should remain calm, do not open the door, wait for them to leave. We've seen this happen with a lot of folks who do this, and I think again it can be very scary to do this in practice, but I think that's sort of the general recommendation. If the warrant is valid, though, obviously there is a decision that folks need to be making. Oftentimes the warrant may just be for one person that's in the home, for example, and so it may be valid and it's for somebody in the home. And so again, the home needs to have a conversation around what you would do in that situation, because there's sort of different options, right? You could, for example, allow them in and then sort of hope that they only target the individual that they're after. But again, potentially that could mean that other folks could be implicated or sort of taken in as well. Or as an example, the person that they're looking for, that person could step out. And that way the rest of the family isn't harmed or taken in. But again, this is only if it's a valid judicial warrant. If it's just an ICE administrative warrant, again, the recommendation is that you not open the door at all and you wait for them to leave. Again, we know that ICE will not respect your rights, and there is a possibility that they may force their way in. And so in this situation where they have forced your way into your home, it's important to remember not to resist. And again, trying to de-escalate the situation. And again, going back to invoking your rights. So saying, I want to invoke my right to remain silent, and I want to speak to a lawyer. So again, this is really important for folks not to say anything incriminating, not to admit they're from another country, or not answer any other questions that ICE or immigration may be asking. And then again, not to sign anything. So again, I think this can be one of the most traumatic experiences for folks. And so I think it's really challenging for folks to think about what they would do in those situations and to remember the different things that they need to remember. But it is important for folks to keep in mind that they do have rights. Okay, and then just for the sake of time, because we are going to send you all these slides, I'm going to go through some of the other ones a little bit faster and just sort of highlight some of the different things that folks should remember. So if you encounter ICE on the street, again, it's important to stay calm and not to run. If you run, that will just look suspicious, and obviously people will, or ICE will potentially arrest you or go after you. And so that is one thing to remember, to stay calm. And again, assert your right. You don't have to answer any questions about where you were born, whether you are a US citizen, or how you entered the country. And again, you have the right to remain silent. And you can ask again, am I free to go? So if you encounter ICE out on the street randomly, you can ask, am I free to go? And then also not consenting to a search. So I do not consent to a search in the event, again, that they pat you down or they want to search you. You can refuse that. Again, that doesn't mean they won't still do it, but it is important to remember that. In the car, it's important to just, again, remain calm, pulling over in a safe place as quickly as possible. This is sort of just generic for any time you're being pulled over. Turning off the engine, turning on the light, opening the window, and then placing your hands on the wheel. The police, again, are not allowed to ask you why they pulled you over, but obviously if this is ICE, they may ask you different questions. And so, again, the most important thing is to say that I want to invoke my right to remain silent, and I want to speak to a lawyer. So again, the idea here is to try and answer as few questions as possible from folks, from ICE, and not to say anything as much as possible. And I think the situation that works is very similar, but again, can be very complicated. But again, in general, depending on the setting, it may look different, but always asking, am I free to go? As a generic answer or question that you can ask of them. And again, trying to sort of remove yourself from that situation. And again, asserting your right to remain silent and saying that you want to speak to a lawyer, and then not signing anything without speaking to a lawyer. A couple of things to note, and a guide that we'll also share out with folks. This is a guide for employers, what to do if immigration comes to your workplace. And so this is geared towards employers. So if you yourself are an employer, own a small business or a business, and would like to take a look at that, we encourage you to do that. But again, I think depending on the location of your workplace, things can look very differently. I think in an ideal world, you'd be able to have a conversation with your colleagues about sort of having a plan about what to do if ICE were to ever come to your workplace, and sort of how you all would react. Having sort of a strategy or a plan is really important. But again, folks should not be answering questions, and folks should be asserting their right to remain silent and not answering questions that ICE may have. So, you've asserted your rights and you've remained silent and all that. That doesn't mean that you won't be detained. And so obviously it still may lead to that. So again, important to remain silent. Don't say anything incriminating. If you've been detained by ICE, you do have a right to contact your consulate as well, or have an officer inform the consulate of your detention. So, this is also important to just know who, like having numbers memorized, for example, and knowing who you would contact if you were ever in a situation, if you could potentially be in this situation. Because obviously, for example, the Mexican consulate is pretty proactive in terms of seeking to help folks who are detained, who need support. And so regardless of what country you're in, having that connection, or at least knowing how to reach them, I think can be really helpful. Additionally, knowing your A number, if you have one, and being able to memorize that and giving it to other people in your family in case they want to, it'll be helpful in terms of identifying where you've been sent. And so there's a website located at ice.gov where you can enter A numbers and personal information of folks to try and find folks. And I think all of that can be really helpful in terms of trying to fight folks' immigration cases. So it's important to keep a copy of your immigration documents with someone you trust. And again, have a plan. Really think about sort of the worst case scenario and having a conversation with your family, friends, loved ones about what you would do if you were in that situation and how you can have a plan in place in case the worst happens. And obviously, we really don't know how this was going to map out. Again, whether folks are going to be detained together or if it's sort of as a unit, as Trump and others have said, in terms of like trying to restart the use of family detention and essentially trying to detain people together. But again, having a plan in place is going to be really helpful. And so related to that, if you are part of a family where there's documented folks that are part of the family or part of a mixed status family where multiple people could face detention or only some, ILRC, the Immigrant Legal Resource Center, has a great family preparedness plan that again we'll link to that you can follow that really walks through what to do in the case of an emergency to really again think ahead in the event that folks are put in this type of situation and really being able to think about who's going to take care of the children and those types of really hard, difficult things to think about, but things that it's better to think about before rather than after they've happened. Another thing to note for bystanders, it's really important to remember that you have a right to record ICE activity as long as you're not interfering or getting in the way of anything that's happening. And so we encourage folks, if you see ICE, again, if you see those colors, cars that we went over, or if you just see suspicious activity, pull out your phone, record. And in the event you don't feel comfortable recording or sort of putting yourself out there in that way, we encourage you to write down as much information as possible, make a note of any were there witnesses? How many officers were there? What was the, were they wearing a badge? Did you catch their name? What did the vehicles look like? Like just noting down as much details as possible is going to be really helpful. And then additionally, reporting all that immigration activity to your local rapid response hotline, which we've shared this before, but again, just want to uplift these. This is a really useful and great tool that the community is utilizing in order to fight back and really defend each other. These numbers are essentially meant to protect folks, and there is growing networks and growing lists of volunteers who are helping to support folks who are who experience immigration encounters. And also one important role they play is also verifying actual ICE activity. And so oftentimes people will think that something is ICE when in reality it might just be law enforcement or other activity. Oftentimes people will see an unmarked van and they'll sort of freak out and think that's ICE, and sometimes it's not. And so these numbers can also just allow folks to be sent as volunteers to confirm and make sure that whatever they're reporting as ICE activity is actually legitimate, so that we're not causing panic, which I think is another thing that we have to be mindful of, to not scare people when the risk is real, but also making sure that we're matching that with reality of what's happening. So these are all the numbers. Folks should save them for sure. If you want to volunteer as well, some of these websites for these programs are linked here as well. So you'll be able to follow those in case you're interested in getting involved and volunteering with your local network. One other thing I wanted to note as well is the Lake and Riley Act. So we've talked about this in the past, and obviously this passed in January, and this was one of the first bills that the Trump administration, I think it was the first, that he signed, and essentially requires mandatory detention for mostly undocumented immigrants who are arrested for, charged with, or that admitted they committed these different crimes. And this could lead to about 110,000 people being detained at a cost of about $86 billion over 3 years. It also allows states to sue the federal government over immigration decisions, including individual cases. So this is essentially just going to lead to more people being targeted and detained, and also it's going to make it really complicated in terms of allowing states to file lawsuits when, for example, a future administration decides to do something different than what this current administration is doing. And so I think this is also just something that is still to be seen in terms of like its negative impacts, but we know that it's not going to be pretty. We've also linked several resources here that again we'll share when we send the slides. You can click on each one, and each of them sends you to a different page where you can see some of the Know Your Rights and various other executive orders outside of immigration that NBC put together, also litigation. So you can see all the various lawsuits against most of the executive actions that have been taken and sort of where they are, and other useful information, how to find different legal representation in California. And again, those links to the rapid response networks. I'll turn it over to Ashley to close us out.
Upcoming events. We have 3 upcoming events. Number 1 is our next in this immigration series, April 1st at 5:30. We'll send the link around, and we will cover the schools stuff and state legislative stuff, and let us know if you have other topics that you'd like us to cover. You may have already had your calendar marked for March 11th for our legislative launch. Things are moving a little slowly in the Capitol, so we're postponing that to April 8th. If you've already registered, you'll get an email about that tomorrow. That was a game time decision today, but you can sign up for that. And then April 14th through 18th, we're doing in-district lobby visits for the spring recess. So thank you. Oh, HR 32. This is a bill that would cut federal funds in more than 24 states that are deemed sanctuaries. And of course, that includes California. It would create chaos. It would blackmail cities and states into aiding the Trump administration's mass deportation agenda. So you should call your member of Congress, go to aclu.org/sanctuary or text sanctuary to 82623. Thank you all very much. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but we are over time. If you would like us to follow up with you on your question, feel free to email us at changemakers@aclunc.org. Thank you all. Have a good night.
Good night, everyone.